Okay, chapter 14, Reconstruction era. A lot of bad stuff happening here. This is a whopper of a lecture. So let's see how I can do this. It's big. It's a lot of information. It's probably going to be a two-part deal here. It's meme free, not because I'm worried about making like edgy anti-Confederate memes. Any chance I could get to make fun of the Confederacy, I'll do it. But more to the point that it takes me 5 or 6 hours to put one of these things together, and then it takes me about 4 more hours to think up and make memes. So sometimes you just got to call it a day. So this is effectively meme free. So my sincerest apologies for that. Let's go over the highlights here and get into a little bit of the details about what's going on in this time period. I'll push back a little bit about some of the stuff in the book and just kind of highlight, how we should read some of these things like sharecropping and stuff like that. And I'll highlight that. I'll bring it out. I've got the book here in front of me. So when it comes to close reading of the book, I'll bring our attention to it. Okay, so let's get this. What's the big story here is, not all that stuff. I don't want to give it all to you like that. Hey, come on, little by little. Come on. The big amendments that are passed during this time period, and they are all probably the most important things of this time period, and historically speaking, are the amendments 13, 14, 15. Because even though we have a massive rollback of civil rights for Black Americans, we still have these amendments preserved, right? And once you get to the level of a constitutional amendment, it's kind of a big deal, with the exception of temperance, which gets undone. An amendment that passes it and then gets undone by the 21st Amendment. Very, very seldom are we going to see a constitutional amendment get turned back. So that's the big deal here. So 13th Amendment, what does it do? Obviously, it abolishes slavery. What does that mean? Remember, if you're a Southern enslaver, your chattel, your property, this is money. This is private property. This is why it's such a controversial thing at the time period. This is the government expropriating or taking about $3 trillion worth of modern money in the form of property and creating 4 million people where there once was property. This is that, remember a few years ago, Kanye West saying we should abolish the 13th Amendment. To be fair, I think what he meant is this subordinate clause here. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States, blah, blah, blah. The reason why that clause is problematic is because the exclusion clause there allows for a subjugated labor force. So gang labor, imprisoned laborers, working out, being leased out, convict leasing, all of this stuff is because it's legal because of that subordinate clause. It's also the reason why, license plates are made by prisoners in California, at least, and that don't make minimum wage. You can legally not pay them, nowhere near the minimum wage because of that subordinate clause. So that's the 13th Amendment. It creates 4 million people, does not create 4 million citizens. So that's where the 14th Amendment comes in, does three things. Citizenship clause gives citizenship to the newly freed human beings. I'll point out here that in 1898, the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment effectively becomes birthright citizenship. So in its original context, the Citizenship Clause means the formerly enslaved are now citizens. But in a Supreme Court decision from 1898, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, it establishes or applies the citizenship clause to people born in the United States. So Wong Kim Ark, his parents are from China. He's born in the U.S. He sues for citizenship under the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment and wins. So from 1898 on, the 14th Amendment grants birthright citizenship. So it's disingenuous if you are so unfortunate as to slither down some rat hole of the internet, and see people kind of advocating for, oh, the original intent of the 14th Amendment didn't mean to apply to, the children of immigrants or whatever. It's not true. 1898, we've got 100 plus years of case law supporting birthright citizenship, but that is for another time period, period 6. So you'll see here with all of these things, I'm going to give you what happened, and then I'm going to give you like 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. The citizenship clause is the one where it's 2 steps forward, 1 step more forward in terms of expanding democracy, expanding rights, expanding equality, as opposed to contracting those things, right? Due process clause. This is limited by the Colfax decision, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. Due process means that you have effectively due process in the eyes of the law, right? You go to court, you have a trial, all of that kind of stuff. Due process, and those rights cannot be violated. I'll talk about the Colfax decision in a second and why that scales back the due process clause. And then the equal protection clause. This is equal protection in public, right? So this is something that equal protection, you'll think of separate but equal segregation. That's a Plessy versus Ferguson is the court case in 1896, in which it says, yes, you can have legally, you do not run afoul of the equal protection clause as long as the accommodations are separate but equal. So separate train cars, separate bathrooms, separate fares, separate everything, as long as it's equal, right? Because it's equal protection. By 1954, it is patently clear, as it was in 20 years before Plessy, that these accommodations were not equal. So Brown versus Board of Education uses the same equal protection clause to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is a little bit of like maybe gov stuff we're getting into here, but it's super interesting. 15th Amendment, universal male suffrage. Obviously, if you're a woman advocating for the vote, this is a huge setback. And it is, and it definitely is, that former enslaved men, now black citizens, were given the vote. That's wonderful. But a lot of women were fighting very hard for women to have the vote also. So you see how, patriarchy still wins the day here. At least in 1869. A lot of the anger about the 15th Amendment on the part of women advocating for suffrage was not completely in their own self-interest as far as wanting to be equal. A lot of it also was rooted in kind of racist sentiment against black men, and also racist and xenophobic sentiment against immigrants, right? That the idea that an Irish immigrant would be able to vote before a white woman was, for a lot of northern elite white women was very offensive, right? As offensive as the idea that a black man would be able to vote before they would. Okay. Andrew Johnson, the worst. Is he the worst? Maybe he's not the worst. Probably the worst. Maybe the worst. Probably the worst. Maybe he's the worst. Is he the worst? Maybe he's the worst. Probably the worst. We could have a game of worst president, and in terms of rolling back civil rights and perpetuating racism. Can we put that all on Johnson's shoulders? I don't know. Maybe not. But he's a bad one. Top 3. He's a white supremacist, so you got that going for you. But that's not unique, right? In this time period, right? It's not unique for a lot of American history. He carries on Lincoln's legacy at first. Remember, Lincoln's not a radical. Again, he does towards the end of the war, he is advocating for emancipation, but he wants to keep the Union together, and he's okay with more moderate, right, demands for the South. So obviously Andrew Johnson also is okay with that at first. He does support the disenfranchisement of Confederates and all that, but he pardons a lot of them, and he uses his pardon power strategically, right? If you were a political ally of his, you get a pardon. If you were a political foe of his, you don't. So he uses the pardon to his own political advantage. He says the Confederate States, come on back in, no problem. Black codes, don't worry about it. Not extending the vote to freedmen, don't worry about it. Come on back. This is not taken very well by Congress. And he starts vetoing the things that Congress passes for him to sign, and this kind of ends the beginning or the first stage of Reconstruction, which is known as presidential Reconstruction. So Andrew Johnson doing his thing, saying, "Hey, it's simpatico. Let's come back into the Union." That is the presidential Reconstruction. He gets impeached. One vote short of conviction in the Senate, as close as it's ever been. I mean, close as it could be to having someone convicted in the Senate. But he isn't impeached. But effectively, at that point, the radical Republicans win supermajorities in the House and the Senate, and Andrew Johnson can't do anything because they have veto proof, right? Majorities. And that ushers in the second stage of Reconstruction, which is congressional Reconstruction. So obviously presidential, Johnson, bad. I mean, if you agree with racial equality. Second stage of Reconstruction, it's Congress, good, again, if you advocate for racial equality. So it's pretty easy to remember the two stages. Johnson isn't doing much, right? They don't like the low bar that he set, all this stuff, racial violence. I've gone over this. So the main radical Republicans, Stevens, Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, Sumner, Wade, and them. That is at the national level. There are radical Republican governments in the background. This image here is a composite daguerreotype, I suppose, of various radical Republican politicians in South Carolina in the time period. You see pretty diverse, black and white. So at the national level, it's the big names, Thaddeus Stevens, Sumner, Wade. But at the state level, it's all kinds of people, as your book does a good job going over. They reject presidential Reconstruction. They pass the Civil Rights Act. The 14th Amendment passes during radical Reconstruction. Again, that is citizenship, due process, equal protection. Again, it's very easy to remember the 13, 14, 15. First thing you got to do is abolish slavery. Second thing so you've abolished slavery, but you haven't granted citizenship. So citizenship, what kind of citizens? Equal ones, not second-class ones. So due process, equal protection. Then you got rid of slavery. You created citizens. What can't they do? They can't vote. So it's just very easy, like you can't have one before the other kind of thing. So the Reconstruction Acts, martial law, I mean, they mean business, man. I mean, come on. Really? Again, you fight a civil war, all of these people die, U.S. soldiers die fighting, and then you're going to let the South just effectively win the race war? They're not having it. Military districts, you have to ratify the 14th Amendment to get back in. Civil Rights Act in 1875 is kind of the last major piece of legislation. And again, we will not see another piece of civil rights legislation for another 100 years. Very dark times for Black Americans in the South, often actually referred to as the racial nadir. A nadir is a low point as opposed to an apex, like a wave has an apex and a nadir, or a curve. So this is ushers in the racial nadir, a massive anti-Black violence, et cetera, until we get to civil rights, which white Southerners don't like either. Okay, radical Republican wish list, and these radical Republicans are radical indeed, and it's it's a red background for a reason. I mean, these guys are like they're pretty red. Again, I'm not saying they're communists, but it's like Sovietsky Soyuz or like what would it be? Respublikansky Soyuz, like they're pretty Soviet. They're pretty like red when we look at the stuff they're advocating for. But why is the question, and we'll explain why. It seems antithetical that like, oh, republicanism and like state socialism seem antithetical, and they are in the 21st century, but they're not in the 1860s, 70s, and I'll show you why. What don't they want? They don't want slavery. They don't want wage slavery either. So they're very much taking an idea from Jefferson or Jackson that workers should have more rights, more power. If we have to have industry, they might as well have more power. You need to have fully independent citizens, no bosses, no wages, because when you have a master, a boss, that person can affect your vote, can influence your politics, etc. So they are Republicans for a reason. They want a republic with free, equal citizens, and you can't have that with all of, various ways of subjugating people. They're fine with patriarchy, right? So they don't they're not very progressive on that count. But when it comes to like men in the public sphere, they want free citizens, right? They advocate for this is the 40 acres and a mule. Everyone should have land. Again, Jeffersonian, Jacksonian, but it's the government doing it, both for poor white and poor black. Again, all forms of economic dependence are incompatible with Republican citizenship. You just can't do it, they say. Right? You have to have free citizens. So how do they do that? Right? They have all of this expansion. The book, and what pages is this on? I don't know where it is. Oh, bottom of 447, top of 448. That goes over pretty good detail. All of the things that they want to provide, either free or very cheaply. Right? Land, the Homestead Act is all about free or cheap land, free education, public schooling, asylums, health services. In South Carolina, they passed health care, well, effectively health services. It's not like universal health care or something in 1867, but health services, legal representation for people accused of crimes, public works. They're building streets. They're putting up street lights. That's the whole Reconstruction, right? They're reconstructing the South. So all of this stuff, right, is the thinking. If you're a radical Republican, the thinking is to be free, you have to have land. To be free, you have to have an education. To be free, you have to have, right, roads to take your crops to harvest, to go to market. To be free, you have to be healthy. You can't succumb to some disease that you could have gotten rid of, right? To be free, you have to have defense if you're accused of a crime. So all of this stuff is about freedom. It's about creating the framework where citizens can be fully independent, fully free to realize whatever they want to do. Obviously, some people don't like this. First in line here is former enslavers. They're not happy about anything, and they're certainly not happy about this, expansion of effectively an expansion of federal power. Right? Remember the whole thing that they, the states' rights thing? So this is, again, an expansion of federal power or an expansion of state power, with the imprimatur or the signing off of the federal government. Wealthy whites, they get poor whites very much on their side and attacking free blacks. They encourage and antagonize and advocate for effectively what has been called a second civil war, which is a race war, a very one-sided race war of white against black. They use mob violence. Again, if you're a elite Southern enslaver, you're not going to go out in the streets and go marauding around town, but you can definitely inspire others to go marauding around town, poorer whites. So that happens. And importantly, poor whites would benefit a lot from these programs. They don't have education. They don't have health care. They don't have any land. So lest they be tempted to actually start advocating for some of this stuff and going, hey, actually, this is pretty good. Like, this actually makes my life a lot better. They remind poor whites of the most important thing there is, which is the color of their skin, right? So as opposed to poor black and poor white unifying, right, coming together and actually trying to, work through the racial antagonisms that had defined their relationship, right? Those antagonisms are perpetuated. So again, they're exploiting both black and white for their own economic self-interest, and they win. Northern industrialists don't like it either, obviously, right? It's one thing if you're messing around giving rights to formerly enslaved people in the South, but once you start talking about you know um, uh, employee-owned businesses, or employees having higher wages or shorter hours or what have you, now you're messing with my dime. So Northern industrialists don't like it either. Um, there's a radical labor climate of the 1870s and 80s. Radical Republicans are, you know, advocating for the rights of formerly enslaved. There's unions forming in the North, and there's all of this labor foment happening. And people are, if you're a Northern industrialist, you're scared to death of this because, again, it's going to it's going to take away from your windfall profits. And when the economy goes in the crapper in 1873, they don't have the money to pay for this stuff anymore. So a lot of Americans start to go, okay, all right, enough is enough, right? The economy after the Civil War is doing really pretty well, in the North at least, and it starts to heat up in the South too. So that's how you can pay for all of these big programs. The same thing as Eisenhower. We'll learn about Eisenhower in the 1950s. He's a Republican. He cuts the size of government, and he builds the national freeways. So huge spending and cutting taxes. You can only do that when the economy is really, really going strong. 21 minutes. I'm going to stop there, and I'll pick it up with more detail on the Freedmen's Bureau, and then some of the violent white response to what is effectively a kind of utopian agenda of the radical Republicans.